The year is 1920, and the sky over Canton, Ohio, has turned to iron. Rain lashes against the plate glass windows of the Hupmobile showroom, a relentless, rhythmic drumming that drowns out the world outside. Water streaks down the panes in jagged rivulets, distorting the streetlights into blurred, flickering smears of yellow. Inside, the air is thick and stagnant, heavy with the scent of damp earth and trapped moisture. The showroom is silent, save for the occasional hiss of the radiator and the sharp, sudden crack of thunder that rattles the frames. Every window pane vibrates under the pressure of the gale, threatening to shatter inward. This is not a place of commerce tonight. It is a bunker. The storm outside mirrors the chaos of the season, a relentless force that has battered these men into this singular, desperate corner. The rain continues to pour, unyielding. As the men wait for the signal to act, the men moved away from the windows, their heavy footsteps echoing on the showroom floor. They gravitated toward the center of the room, where a cast-iron pot-bellied stove radiated a dull, orange glow. This was their only sanctuary against the damp chill. They were not wealthy men in refined attire. They were local team owners, their presence marked by the grit of the field. Thick layers of dried mud clung to the soles of their boots, flaking off onto the polished hardwood with every shift of weight. They stood in a tight, uneven circle, shoulders hunched, hands outstretched toward the iron belly of the stove. The heat hissed as a stray drop of rainwater fell from a sleeve and struck the metal. They did not speak at first, only watched the embers pulse behind the grate. Their faces were etched with the exhaustion of long travel and the strain of managing squads that barely held together. Each man carried the weight of a team that existed on little more than willpower and local pride. The silence broke, replaced by the low, jagged murmur of men pushed to their limits. One owner kicked at a pile of dried mud on the floor, his jaw tight. He spoke of his star halfback, who vanished on a Sunday morning for a mere $5 bribe from a rival town. Every week, rosters shifted like sand in a gale. A team would find their best players missing at kickoff. The frustration rippled through the circle. They were pouring their own meager savings into uniforms and travel. There was no loyalty, no contracts, and no foundation. Every Sunday was a gamble against their own squads. The game was bleeding out, drained by the constant turnover. They were tired of the frantic, aimless scramble. The instability was no longer a nuisance. It was a death sentence for their sport. The murmur of complaints died out as Ralph Hay stepped toward the heavy oak table. He did not wait for an opening in the conversation. He brought his palm down against the wood with a sharp, resounding crack that silenced the room instantly. The vibration traveled through the table, rattling a stack of invoices left near the edge. He leaned forward, his weight balanced on his knuckles, and fixed his gaze on the men standing across from him. There was no room left for negotiation or half measures. He looked at each of them, waiting for the echo of his strike to fade. "We organize, or we fold," he said, his voice cutting through the space. The words hung in the air, stripped of any pretense. It was a blunt, uncompromising choice. He straightened his back, his hands still pressed firmly against the table. The men shifted, their eyes darting from the table to Hay, then back to the floor. The reality of his demands settled over them like a physical weight. Hay did not blink. He held his position, waiting for the room to commit. The air felt thin, charged with sudden clarity. The decision rippled through the room, turning hesitation into a singular, heavy resolve. Pens scratched against paper, formalizing a pact that had no precedent. They named it the American Professional Football Association. 14 teams, 14 distinct interests, now bound by a single, fragile document. It was a gamble that felt doomed from the first stroke of the pen. Outside, The rain continued to beat against the showroom glass. They were not building a titan. They were stitching together a patchwork quilt of survival. Each owner looked at the signatures, knowing that the ink was the only thing holding their ambitions together. There were no guarantees, no blueprints, and no public interest to sustain them. They were betting their livelihoods on a sport that most people considered a weekend distraction at best. The room felt smaller now, the weight of their collective risk pressing in from the walls. They had created a structure, but the foundation was nothing more than a desperate hope. As they set their pens down, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of men who had jumped off a cliff and were waiting to see if they would fly or fall. The APFA existed, but the real test was only just beginning. The ink on the agreement had barely dried before the reality of their endeavor took hold. There were no chartered trains or comfortable cabins for these men. To reach the next town, they climbed into the back of open-bed trucks, stacking themselves among their gear. The engine sputtered to life, and the vehicle lurched forward, pulling them into the dark, rain-slicked countryside. As the truck gathered speed, the wind became a physical force, cutting through the space with relentless intensity. It whipped against their faces, numbing skin and forcing eyes to squint against the spray. They huddled together, shoulders pressed against shoulders, seeking warmth in the proximity of their teammates. The floor of the truck bed vibrated violently, rattling their bones with every pothole and uneven stretch of gravel. There was no shelter from the elements, only the endurance of the journey itself. They spent hours exposed to the biting air, watching the landscape blur into a gray smear. Every mile was a test of resolve, a quiet battle against the exhaustion. They did not speak. They simply held on, knowing the road was the first opponent. The truck finally slowed, grinding to a halt at the edge of a pasture that served as the day's arena. There were no grandstands, no manicured turf, and no clear boundaries. The field was a patchwork of frozen ruts and patches of dead grass, scarred by the tracks of farm equipment. At either end, the goalposts stood as a testament to the league's desperate improvisation. They were nothing more than young saplings. The wood was crooked, leaning at precarious angles, held upright by piles of loose stones and packed dirt. A player stepped off the truck and sank ankle-deep into the mud, his boots struggling to find purchase on the slick, uneven earth. He walked toward the end zone, testing the ground with his weight, feeling the hidden stones that threatened to snap an ankle. They stood in the cold, staring at the primitive setup, knowing the terrain was as much an adversary as the opposing team. The whistle blew, and the silence of the pasture vanished under the sound of colliding bodies. There was no padding to absorb the force of the hits. Every tackle sent a shockwave through the players, a dull thud that resonated against the hard, frozen earth. In the second quarter, a collision left one player crumpled on the sideline, his breath hitching in sharp, jagged gasps. He clutched his side, his fingers digging into the muscle between his ribs. The pain was immediate and blinding, a white-hot flare that made his vision swim. He collapsed back against the wooden bench, his face drained of color. There was no medical staff to evaluate the damage, no trainer to offer a stretcher. There was only a roll of adhesive tape left on a crate. He reached for it, his hands trembling as he pulled the fabric tight across his torso. He wrapped the tape around his chest, layer after layer, binding the ribs to force his body into a rigid, artificial stability. He walked back onto the field, his movements stiff and measured, and signaled to the referee that he was ready. By 1922, the league sought to shed its reputation for disorder. The owners gathered once more, this time to cast off the title of the American Professional Football Association. They chose a new name, one that carried the weight of authority and national ambition: the National Football League. It was a title that sounded grand, echoing through the halls of commerce and promising a future of stability. Yet, the ink on the new stationery was barely dry before the old problems resurfaced. The owners sat in dimly lit offices, staring at the same ledger books that had haunted them since the beginning. They traced the columns of figures, watching the numbers fail to balance. The name had changed, but the foundation remained as brittle as ever. There were no massive sponsorship deals, no television contracts, and no surge in ticket sales to justify the new, imposing designation. The league was a shell, a collection of local interests struggling to maintain a facade of professionalism while the actual operations teetered on the edge of collapse. They had built a monument of words, hoping that if they called it a national institution, the public would eventually believe it. But as the winter wind rattled the window panes, the reality of their situation remained grim. The grand title was a thin veil, stretched tight over a skeleton of debt and uncertainty, failing to hide the cracks that threatened to pull the entire structure down. The grand name could not pay the bills. By mid-season, the fragility of the league turned into a rapid, cascading failure. One Tuesday morning, the owner of a Midwestern franchise walked into his locker room to find the benches empty and the equipment bags gone. His players had not waited for the final whistle of the season. They had simply walked away to find work in the local steel mills. He opened the team's cash box, finding nothing but dust and a few scattered receipts. There was no money left for travel. He locked the doors for the last time, leaving the league's schedule with a gaping hole. This was not an isolated incident. Across the circuit, teams began to dissolve with terrifying speed. Payrolls vanished overnight. Owners found themselves staring at empty stadiums. The league was hemorrhaging members, each departure pulling the remaining teams closer to the brink. A schedule was now a list of ghosts. The remaining owners held frantic, whispered meetings, but the momentum was gone. They were running out of opponents, out of time. The economic collapse did not just hurt the league, it threatened to erase it. As the Great Depression tightened its grip on the nation, the few remaining teams found themselves operating in a void. There were no investors, no public interest, and no surplus cash to keep the lights on. The league existed only because the owners refused to accept the end. They operated out of drafty, unheated rooms, burning through their own personal savings, just to field a team on Sunday. It was a period of absolute austerity. Players often played for nothing more than a hot meal, and the promise of a future that seemed increasingly unlikely. The league became a flickering flame in a landscape of total darkness. Every game played was an act of defiance against the crushing weight of the era. They did not play for glory or profit. They played because the game was the only thing they had left. When the world outside turned gray and hopeless, the gridiron offered a singular, stubborn point of light. It was a test of endurance that stripped away everything non-essential, leaving only the raw, unyielding core of the sport. They were not building an empire. They were simply refusing to let the fire go out. The decade turned, and with it, the world shifted on its axis. The 1950s arrived, carrying a piece of technology that would dismantle the old boundaries of the sport. It started as a heavy, glowing box, finding its way into the corner of the American living room. This was not just furniture. It was a portal. For decades, the game had been a local affair, tied to the mud of regional fairgrounds and the physical presence of a few hundred spectators. That changed in an instant. The television set hummed to life, casting a flickering blue light against the walls of quiet homes. Families rearranged their chairs, turning their backs on the windows. The game was no longer a destination one traveled to. It was a guest invited into the domestic sphere. A father sat on a sofa, his attention locked on the small glowing aperture, while the rest of the house fell silent. The barrier between the gridiron and the public had been breached. No longer did a fan need to endure the biting wind, or the trek to a remote field to witness the action. The action came to them, filtered through wires and vacuum tubes. This was the moment the scale of the sport began to expand, stretching from the confines of a small town to the reach of a national audience. The era of the hidden, local struggle was ending, replaced by the immediate presence of the broadcast. The broadcast was grainy, a wash of gray tones and flickering static, yet it possessed a power the muddy fields never could. Through the lens, the players were no longer just anonymous bodies colliding in the distance. The camera pushed in, capturing the smear of dirt across a jawline and the sharp, focused intensity in a pair of eyes. For the first time, a fan could see the individual effort behind the play. A player who had spent years as a nameless laborer suddenly gained a face, a signature movement, and a name that echoed in living rooms across the country. The broadcast stripped away the anonymity of the regional brawl. It turned the sweat-drenched exertion of the game into a series of distinct human stories. A man would stand up from his chair, pointing at the screen, as a specific player broke through the line, recognizing him not as a team member, but as a personality. This was the birth of the sports hero in the modern sense. The television did not just transmit the game. It magnified the humanity of the participants. Every grimace of pain, every sudden burst of speed, and every moment of exhaustion became a public performance. The game began to speak a language that everyone understood, regardless of where they sat. It was a visual grammar formed by the repetition of the broadcast, the snap of the ball, the sudden collision, the slow-motion replay that dissected the violence of the play. This was no longer a disparate collection of regional matches. It was a synchronized event. Across the country, from the industrial hubs of the north to the quiet suburbs of the west, millions watched the same movements at the same time. The visual language of the sport became a shorthand for excitement, a specific camera angle, a certain pace of play, and the way the field was framed created a predictable, reliable rhythm that hooked the national imagination. People who had never stepped foot in a stadium now understood the stakes of a third-down conversion. They argued over strategies and cheered for the same icons, bound together by the glowing screen. The sport had successfully escaped the boundaries of the local fairground to claim a permanent seat at the American table. It was a transformation of scale that turned a rough, physical struggle into a sophisticated, televised spectacle. The game had successfully woven itself into the fabric of the national identity. Just as the league settled into its dominance, the ground shifted beneath its feet. A new force emerged, calling itself the American Football League. It did not arrive with the quiet, stubborn endurance of the early pioneers. It arrived with noise, color, and a deliberate, aggressive disregard for the established order. The AFL was a direct challenge to the NFL, a brash upstart that refused to play by the old rules. While the traditional league relied on methodical, ground-based strategy, the new rival prioritized speed, verticality, and the long pass. They filled their rosters with players the NFL had overlooked, turning them into stars overnight. The stadiums were louder, the plays were riskier, and the presentation was designed to capture the attention of a younger, restless audience. It was a calculated disruption. The NFL, long comfortable in its position as the sole authority, suddenly found itself forced to defend its territory. The new league did not just want to exist, it wanted to replace the incumbent. Every Sunday became a battle for the eyes of the nation. The rivalry quickly bled from the field into the front offices. It became a war of ledgers and checkbooks. Every star player became a prize to be snatched, and the price of talent began to spiral out of control. When a standout athlete emerged, the NFL and the AFL would descend with competing offers, each trying to outbid the other. Contracts that once seemed generous were now considered insulting. Players found themselves in the position of power. It was a chaotic, hostile auction. The pressure to secure the best talent meant that owners were signing checks they could barely afford. Millions of dollars vanished into the pockets of athletes, while the leagues drained their own reserves to keep pace. Owners sat in smoke-filled rooms, staring at balance sheets that showed nothing but mounting debt. The industry was burning through its own capital, pushed to the very edge of collapse by the sheer intensity of the pursuit. The fever finally broke, replaced by a cold, sharp realization. The war of attrition was not producing a winner. It was dismantling the foundation of the sport. Every dollar spent to steal a player from the rival was a dollar stripped from the long-term health of the game. Attendance figures stagnated as the constant hostility turned off the casual fan. The product on the field suffered, overshadowed by the headlines of bankrupting contracts. Owners looked across the table at their counterparts and saw not an enemy to be crushed, but a mirror reflecting their own impending ruin. The realization hit with the force of a blindside tackle. They were cannibalizing the very industry they sought to lead. If the bidding continued, there would be no league left to govern. The hostility that had fueled the expansion now threatened to burn it to the ground. Silence replaced the shouting in the executive suites. The aggressive posturing gave way to a desperate, quiet assessment of the wreckage. The path forward was no longer about dominance through destruction, but survival through compromise. The realization was absolute. The war had to end. The meeting took place in a room stripped of the previous year's hostility. There were no shouting matches, no threats of bankruptcy, and no aggressive posturing. Instead, there was the heavy, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock and the scent of ink. Representatives from both leagues sat at a long, polished table, their movements measured and deliberate. The document lay flat in the center, a thick stack of pages bound by legal necessity. One by one, the owners leaned forward. They took the pen, pressed the nib against the paper, and signed their names with steady, practiced hands. The scratching of the nib against the parchment was the only sound in the room. Each signature was a final, irreversible strike against the old way of doing business. As the last name was inscribed, the tension that had defined the decades simply evaporated. The document was closed, the folder snapped shut, and the two separate entities ceased to exist as rivals. The pioneer era ended in that single, quiet moment. The ink dried, sealing the fate of the sport. The ink had barely settled before the work of building an empire began. The merger was not merely a legal formality. It was a total reconfiguration of the professional landscape. Offices that had operated in isolation now shared a single unified command structure. Rules that once varied from one league to the next were codified into a single rigid standard. The chaos of competing schedules vanished, replaced by a master calendar that brought order to the chaos of the previous decade. Front office staff moved between cities, consolidating operations and streamlining the flow of revenue. Every department, from scouting to ticket sales, shifted toward a singular corporate objective. The amateurish remnants of the pioneer era were systematically purged, replaced by professional systems designed for scale and longevity. This was the birth of a machine. It operated with a cold, calculated efficiency that the founders in the Hupmobile showroom could never have envisioned. The league was no longer a collection of desperate teams fighting for survival. It was a singular, powerful entity. The professional era had arrived, and it was built to last. The championship game underwent a radical metamorphosis. It shed its identity as a mere season-ending contest and expanded into a global spectacle. Television networks poured resources into the broadcast, turning the game into a high-production event that demanded the attention of the entire nation. The halftime show grew from a local marching band performance into a massive, choreographed concert that drew viewers who had no interest in the sport itself. Advertisers began to treat the broadcast as the most important commercial window of the year, spending millions for seconds of airtime. The game became a magnet for cultural trends, fashion, and celebrity presence. It was no longer just about the score on the board. It was about the spectacle surrounding the field. Millions of households tuned in simultaneously, creating a shared experience that stopped the rhythm of daily life. The event transcended the boundaries of the gridiron, becoming a centerpiece of the calendar. It was a calculated, massive expansion of the product, designed to capture the world's focus for one Sunday every February. The game had successfully evolved from a local competition into a dominant cultural force. The era of the muddy, uneven field had finally come to an end. Those sapling goalposts and dirt patches were replaced by massive concrete cathedrals, rising from the earth like monuments to the game. These were not mere stadiums. They were feats of engineering designed to contain the roar of 80,000 people. The construction crews poured endless tons of steel and cement, creating steep, towering tiers that funneled the sound of the crowd directly onto the grass. Every seat offered a sightline, and every row hummed with the collective energy of the spectators. Inside these arenas, the wind no longer dictated the flow of play, and the rain could not turn the ground into a quagmire. When the home team emerged from the tunnel, the noise was a physical force, a wall of sound that rattled the rafters. These venues became the heartbeat of their cities, massive structures where the passion of the fans was amplified. Beyond the roar of the crowd, a different kind of power took hold. The game evolved into a sophisticated billion-dollar machine that operated with the precision of a global enterprise. Every snap, every tackle, and every touchdown became a unit of value in a vast economic network. Television networks fought for exclusive rights, paying billions for the privilege to broadcast the action to a worldwide audience. Corporate sponsors lined the sidelines, their logos woven into the very fabric of the league's identity. The game generated revenue streams that reached into merchandise, licensing, and digital media, creating a financial ecosystem that dwarfed the humble beginnings of the early years. It was no longer just a contest between teams. It was a dominant force in the global economy. Investors watched the numbers climb, seeing the league as a reliable, high-growth asset that defied market fluctuations. The business of the game became as complex and intense as the play on the field. This was a machine that never stopped. The transformation reached its zenith on a single Sunday every February. What began as a local contest had mutated into a global phenomenon. When the game day arrived, the rhythm of daily life shifted. Streets in major cities emptied as millions retreated into their homes, gathering around screens to witness the spectacle. It was a collective pause, a synchronized moment where the world seemed to hold its breath. The game transcended its status as a sport. It became a cultural anchor, a shared ritual that bridged gaps between nations. Businesses shuttered, travel slowed, and the focus of the planet narrowed down to the green turf inside the stadium. This was not just a championship. It was a juggernaut that dictated the calendar. Even those who rarely followed the season found themselves drawn in. The sheer weight of the audience created a gravity that pulled in advertisers, performers, and casual observers alike. It was a total saturation. By the time the final whistle blew, the game had woven itself into the fabric of modern life, a testament to how far it had traveled from its muddy origins. Look back to that rainy night in Canton, and the distance traveled becomes impossible to ignore. The Hupmobile showroom floor was barely large enough to hold the men who gathered there, their boots caked in the grime of a Sunday brawl. Compare that cramped, dim space to the modern gridiron, where stadium lights burn with the intensity of a small sun. The transition is not just a change in venue. It is a total reconstruction of reality. Where once there were saplings serving as goalposts, now there are towering structures of steel and glass. Where once players rode in the back of open trucks, shivering against the wind, now they arrive in private jets to play before 80,000 screaming spectators. The transformation spans a full century of relentless evolution. It is a path carved through decades of uncertainty, folding teams and empty payrolls. The roar that fills the stadium today is the echo of that first, desperate slam of a hand against a table. The journey from the showroom to the blinding lights is complete, a transformation that reshaped the landscape of sports forever. The survival of this game was never a guarantee. It was a defiance of probability. Through the lean years of the Great Depression, when payrolls vanished and teams dissolved into the ether, the league existed only because it refused to stop. It was a flickering flame in a gale, yet it held its ground. Players wrapped broken ribs in tape and returned to the mud, not for fame, but because the alternative was to let the game die. This was the raw, unpolished grit that built the foundation. When the world turned its back, the league tightened its grip. It survived on the stubbornness of owners who risked everything in a showroom, and players who endured the biting wind in the back of open trucks. There was no glory in those early, desperate seasons, only the relentless drive to play one more down. This refusal to fade away is the true legacy of the sport. The game did not survive by accident. It survived because it was built to withstand the pressure, a living testament to the power of pure, unyielding human will. Every legend has a starting point, and this is where the roar of the stadium began. It traces back to that single, desperate meeting in a car showroom, where the future of a sport hung on the strength of a slammed hand against a wooden table. That moment of defiance was the spark. It was the decision to organize or fold, a choice that turned a fragile local gamble into an enduring institution. Think of the ink on that first agreement, drying in the quiet of a rainy Ohio night, and compare it to the global spectacle that halts the world every February. The distance between the two is immense, yet they are tethered by an unbroken line of resolve. The players who once cut saplings for goalposts and the modern titans who compete under blinding stadium lights share the same fundamental DNA. They are bound by the same commitment to the next down, the next yard, and the next victory. The modern gridiron is the ultimate realization of that impossible dream, a machine built on the grit of those who refuse to let the game die. What started as a flicker in a dark room has become a force that commands the attention of millions. The roar you hear today is simply the echo of that first, quiet, and necessary act of courage. Listen to the sound. It begins as a low hum, a vibration that travels through the concrete floor and up into the soles of your feet. Then, it breaks. 80,000 voices rise in a single, synchronized wave, a wall of noise that swallows the air. This is not just a crowd. It is the physical weight of a century. Every yard gained, every collision on the field, and every desperate lunge for the goal line feeds this singular, thunderous roar. It is the sound of an impossible dream finally finding its voice. In this moment, the mud of the early fields and the cold wind of the open trucks are forgotten, replaced by the blinding intensity of the modern gridiron. The stadium pulses with the energy of millions, a living, breathing machine that demands everything from those on the field. This is the ultimate realization of what began in that small, quiet showroom in Ohio. The noise is absolute. It is the roar of a game that refused to fold, a sound that echoes across the decades to prove that the gamble was worth the cost. The dream is no longer a fragile hope. It is a titan that commands the world, and it is louder than it has ever been. The stadium lights dim, and the thunderous roar slowly recedes into the quiet of the night. What remains is not the noise, but the foundation. Think back to that rain-slicked street in Canton, the smell of damp wool, and the flickering light of a single stove. That room was the crucible. It held no grandstands, no television cameras, and no promise of fame. It held only the stubborn refusal to quit. That singular, gritty persistence is the true legacy of the game. It is found in the calloused hands of the early players, who rode in the back of open trucks, and it lives on in the relentless drive of the modern athlete. The concrete cathedrals and the billion-dollar machines are merely the architecture of an idea that started with nothing. When the final whistle blows and the crowds disperse, the history remains. It is etched into the very grass of the field. It is a story of survival, written in sweat and iron, proving that even the most fragile gamble can grow into a force that changes the world forever.